forced to retreat into an alleyway between two homes. And he stayed there for 45 minutes until he knocked on the door next door, and he fled into the house. As soon as he jumped into the doorway, Israeli soldiers shot at him, and they also shot one of the gas canisters outside of the home. Because of the gas shortage, Palestinian families use small canisters of gas. Well, one of them was shot when Marwan jumped inside, and it began to leak into the home where 50 people were taking refuge. He was immediately on the phone with the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, and very significantly, the Red Cross communicates with the Israeli army only after getting approval to travel to an area to pick up the injured do they travel. So at no time is an ambulance any surprise to the Israeli army. So this, what we hear, this justification for shooting ambulances because they carry weapons and militants and etc., doesn't hold any water. Because these are prior approved ambulances that are gaining access. And yet despite this approval, Marwan was shot at, forced into a home where there was gas leaking with 50 civilians, children, mothers, fathers, and he was on the phone trying to coordinate how to get out. Eventually, international media, like Al Jazeera, was calling him to get him live on the air. And because of his exposure, as he was on the phone, he sung them, "We're suffocating, we have to get out." And as he was on the phone with them, apparently his line was intercepted because he then received a phone call from a man speaking in Arabic with an Israeli accent who identified himself as a field worker with Beit Salem, which is an Israeli human rights organization in Jerusalem. And that man told him, asked him very typical questions: how many people are there? Are there children? Are you okay? And then began to ask him, are there weapons? Is anyone armed? Are you militant? Is this stakeout? Marwan knew the questions were odd and said, look, we just want to get out. And the man said, how many of you want to leave? He said, I want to take as many as will fit in my ambulance. And the man on the other line said, okay, I'll call you right back. When he called back, he said, I'll let you out, but you have to tell me where so-and-so militant is from the Qassam Brigade. But Marwan is an ambulance driver who is from a resident in Khuza'a, who has no idea who the militant is and where he may be. And he told them, I don't know who that person is. I don't know where he is. And the man on the other line said, then we cannot let you out of the house. And in essence, held the medical personnel, along with the 50 other civilians, hostage for information they didn't have, which exemplifies what happens in all of Gaza, because the entire neighborhood was attacked for the same reason, for the same militant, which really exemplifies what happens in all of Gaza, where 1.5 million Palestinians were held hostage for militants belonging to Hamas that may or may not have been militant, because as you know, Hamas is also a political party that represents a political line and was democratically elected into government in January 2006, as well as being a social service organization. And many of the young men that we met that belonged to Hamas belonged to it because they were the only entity that paid them salaries monthly. And so that's why from the same family, one young man may be from Hamas, but another may be from Fatah, and it has nothing to do with political ideology. Of legal weapons in illegal ways, and as you've all heard, white phosphorus was used very explicitly, intentionally, no even attempt to mask the use of white phosphorus, an indication that Israel has internalized that it can act with impunity, to not even try to hide this type of crime. Because although white phosphorus isn't illegal, it's not a chemical weapon, it's an incendiary weapon, but it ignites upon a chemical reaction with oxygen. And it can only be put out with sand when it doesn't have access to oxygen. It's illegal because it doesn't stop burning. And in heavily populated areas, it can inflict a serious amount of damage and harm. And Sabah Abu Halima is one example of that damage and harm. She was in her home with her sons, her one daughter, who aged 15 months, and her husband, when there was fighting going outside of her home in Beit Lahia, which is outside of Gaza City. And her children asked her for lunch. And she, being too afraid to get them lunch, told them, "I'll make you sandwiches instead." And when she left to get them sandwiches, white phosphorus missiles fell directly onto her home. She saw her husband and one of her sons beheaded. Her 15-month-old daughter in her arms died instantly. She was knocked out. But before she was knocked out, she told me the story of how she saw her son, Hamza, 8 years old, who she describes as melting to death, or just melting actually, screaming to her, "Yamma, yamma, nar, yamma," or "Mama, mama, fire." And when she woke up from being out of consciousness, she had to drag her body outside of her home because medical personnel were also denied entry. And she ended up dragging her body 100 meters until a civilian car picked her up to take her to a hospital, where I met her at Shifa Hospital in northern Gaza. Her arms are wrapped because the white phosphorus in her body, before doctors knew what it was, and they knew to remove it, because so long as it's in the body, it continues to burn into the skin, eventually to the bone. And before doctors knew what it was, and they knew what it was, by the way, in consultation with doctors from Lebanon, who saw its effects during the war in 2006. And so, this is a picture of her foot. And these, by the way, are the most palatable pictures. I didn't share the other ones, but I can later. And her hand. And Sabah, Sabah will eventually leave the hospital. She's going to heal. But 5 of her family members have been killed. 3 of her sons, her husband, and her daughter. 3 of her sons now survive but are homeless and are going from home to home. She doesn't sleep because she sees the images of her melting children and her beheaded family members. And when she leaves, she won't have a home to go to, and there is no fresh start to have, because there is no sustainable economy. There are no markets to go buy groceries from to make dinner for anybody. There's no schools to attend. There's no hospitals to volunteer at. This is not just about the attack on Gaza. This is about the continuing strangulation of the Palestinian population within Gaza, in the West Bank as well, in East Jerusalem, and throughout Israel, who are subject to institutional discrimination. And so I'll leave it at that and share more at the end with next steps. Thank you.
Galloway from the UK was bringing 100 vehicles that they had driven from the UK filled with humanitarian assistance. And along the way in Libya, Muammar Gaddafi had given another 100 vehicles filled with humanitarian aid. So the Egyptians knew that that border was going to be hopping, and unless they started moving people through it, it was going to be, well, it was going to be what the world ought to be seeing every single day, with the international community, us, the people, knocking down those borders, those walls that our international governments have set up. I'd like to ask one of our photographers that we had with us on our trip, a photographer who's been working for the last years and trying to document as much work on the peace movement all over the country. And we were so honored that Paul Park was with us and took some tremendous photographs and videos. Paul, would you please share with us?
Mother sobbing, father's heart into two. When your heart dies, ours does too. Shame on you, people who have power in your say. Shame on you, people who see this as a game. Shame on you, your power is used and innocent. But one day, You learn the hard way.